The news spread like wildfire across the globe, igniting a mixture of disbelief and cautious optimism. After months of relentless warfare, Ukraine had launched a series of unprecedented strikes on key energy facilities deep within Russian territory. The audacity of the operation was staggering. It was a bold statement of resilience and tactical ingenuity that caught many by surprise. For too long, the narrative had been dominated by the overwhelming might of the Russian military. But now, the tide seemed to be shifting. As the dust settled from the explosions, analysts and military experts scrambled to assess the ramifications of this bold Ukrainian maneuver. The energy labs, critical to Russia's military operations and its economy, were not just symbols of power. They were the lifeblood of the Kremlin's war machine. For years, these facilities had been the backbone of Russia's energy infrastructure, supporting everything from civilian power needs to military logistics. The strikes had not only disrupted operations, but had also sent a clear message that Ukraine was no longer willing to be merely reactive. In the days that followed, the Kremlin's response was telling. Initially, there was silence, a strategic pause, as officials scrambled to assess the damage and formulate a plan. But as the reality of the situation began to sink in, the veneer of invulnerability that Putin had cultivated began to crack. The Russian president, known for his steely demeanor and unyielding approach, found himself facing an unprecedented challenge. The weight of public opinion, both domestically and internationally, began to shift. Citizens, who had been fed a steady diet of propaganda portraying Ukraine as a weak adversary, were now confronted with the stark reality of their own vulnerabilities. In the heart of Moscow, whispers of dissent began to surface. Social media, despite the Kremlin's attempts to control the narrative, was flooded with videos and testimonials from citizens grappling with the implications of the strikes. The once unquestioned support for the war began to waver as the economic consequences of the conflict became painfully apparent. Energy prices soared, and the prospect of a harsh winter loomed large. The very fabric of Russian society, already frayed by years of sanctions and isolation, began to unravel further as people questioned the cost of their government's ambitions. Putin, sensing the shifting tides, attempted to rally his supporters. He delivered a series of speeches, filled with bravado, vowing to retaliate and restore Russia's strength. But the confidence in his words was tinged with desperation. The military, once a symbol of national pride, was now a source of concern. Reports of low morale and logistical failures began to emerge, painting a picture of a military struggling to maintain its grip on the situation. The strikes had not only damaged physical infrastructure, but had also eroded the myth of invincibility that had surrounded the Russian armed forces. Meanwhile, Ukraine, buoyed by the success of its operations, found itself at a crossroads. The international community, which had been cautiously supporting Kyiv with military aid and diplomatic backing, was now more willing to engage. Leaders from around the world began to visit Ukraine, offering not just support, but also a renewed commitment to its sovereignty. The strikes had galvanized a sense of unity among allies, showcasing the resilience and determination of the Ukrainian people. As the Ukrainian government navigated this new landscape, it was clear that the stakes had never been higher. The military successes on the battlefield needed to be matched with diplomatic efforts to secure long-term stability. Ukrainian leaders understood that while military victories were essential, they could not afford to become complacent. The threat from Russia was far from over, and a robust strategy for peace and reconstruction was paramount. In the weeks that followed, the pressure on Putin intensified. International sanctions escalated, targeting not just the energy sector, but also individuals within the Kremlin. The unity among Western nations, once fragile, solidified into a formidable front. Countries that had previously hesitated to take a strong stance against Russia now found common ground in supporting Ukraine's fight for freedom. The narrative had shifted from one of inevitability to one of possibility, and the world watched as a new chapter unfolded. As the winter approached, the reality of the situation weighed heavily on the Russian populace. The once steadfast belief in their government began to erode, replaced by a growing sense of uncertainty and fear. Protests erupted in various cities, with citizens demanding answers and accountability. The Kremlin, caught off guard by the public's reaction, struggled to maintain control. The narrative that had once painted Ukraine as the aggressor was now being turned on its head, as Russians began to question the very motives of their leadership. Putin, cornered and facing unprecedented challenges, was forced to reconsider his approach. The pressure mounted, both from within and outside the country. He could no longer rely solely on military might to assert his dominance. The world was changing, and with it, the dynamics of power. The notion of strength was being redefined, and Putin's inability to adapt to this new reality became glaringly apparent. In a historic turn of events, as the first snow began to blanket the streets of Moscow, Putin announced a retreat from his aggressive stance. It was a decision born not out of weakness, but out of necessity. The strikes on the energy labs had altered the landscape of the conflict, forcing him to reassess his priorities. The world watched, a collective breath held in anticipation of what this meant for the future. The implications of Ukraine's bold actions reverberated far beyond the battlefield. They had ignited a spark of hope in a world weary of conflict. The resilience of the Ukrainian people, their unwavering spirit in the face of adversity, had not only changed the course of their own nation, but had also inspired a global movement for justice and freedom. The fight was far from over, but the tides had shifted, and with it, the possibility of a brighter future began to emerge on the horizon.